Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Now, for those of you who don't know much about CIS, we're a public policy research organisation. We've been around since 1976, and during the past 4 decades, we've been front and centre of public policy debates in Canberra on a wide range of issues, from economics and education to cultural issues, as well as Indigenous affairs. But in recent times, we've been very much engaged in the debate surrounding our nation's China policy. So we all too often hear from the foreign policy experts about China policy. But what about future generations? What about future leaders? After all, they will have to live with the consequences of today's policy choices. We thought we'd invite one of Australia's most distinguished journalists, Peter Hartcher, the political and international editor from the Sydney Morning Herald, to put things in a broader context. Peter, as I mentioned, has been a prominent journalist at both the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian Financial Review for the best part of 40 years. Peter is the author of many award-winning and prominent books, most recently Red Zone, China's Challenge and Australia's Future, which is published by Black Ink. And with that, please welcome Peter Hartcher.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, a couple of old windbags like you and me. Everybody's sick of hearing old windbags like Switzer and me. That's why I applaud your initiative, Tom, in organising tonight's debate. Bring some fresh, interesting new talent to the podium. And as you say, Tom, the generation that are going to have to live with the consequences of the decisions taken today, let's hear their voices, let's hear their perspectives. It's a great idea. Enough of the old windbags. But having said that, Tom wants me to be an old windbag for just another 10 or 15 minutes before we let you hear the interesting speakers. Let me lull you into a sense of stupor, and then they can wake you up. Forgive me and my red wine. If you don't like people drinking red wine as they speak to you, don't invite journalists to come and talk to you. Be my other word of advice for the evening. That's not bad for a CIS function, Tom. Thank you. So we know there's a problem in the relationship between Beijing and Canberra. To quote Kevin Rudd, bilateral relations are at their worst since they were founded in 1972, when diplomatic recognition began. But what's it about? What is the problem about? We hear lots of different ideas, critiques, lines, arguments, rhetoric. We hear some people, business people, and others tell us that it's just a matter of engaging better with Beijing. We hear others, helpfully the Trade Minister of New Zealand recently told Australia that Australia just had to show more respect to Beijing. We hear that it's a trade war. We hear that it's a tit for tat. Trade seems to come up a lot. Before we get into what it's actually about, there's one thing that we in Australia have to make sure it is not about and does not become about, and that is about the 1.3 million Australian citizens of Chinese ancestry, the Chinese Australian community. We have to make sure that we keep very clearly uppermost in our minds that the Chinese Australian community is an Australian community, an essential national asset, not a liability, and that we have to keep sober and clear about that, regardless of what political disputes occur, and embrace, welcome, and protect and nurture the Chinese Australian community at all points. We know Australia has a pretty dreadful history of race relations with the White Australia phase. It was a dreadful historical mistake from which I think we've never recovered. I talk about it in the book, so I'm not going to have to bother you with that just now, but we have to make sure we don't veer back towards some of those worst instincts of Australian historical memory. So what is it actually about? Well, the Chinese embassy in Canberra very helpfully took the guesswork out of it last November when a colleague of mine who works at Nine, it's taken me a while before I've been able to say this, but the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age are now owned by Nine Entertainment. And a colleague of mine from Nine News got a phone call from the embassy in China at 48 hours' notice and was told, Jonathan Kearsley was told to meet some Chinese embassy diplomats at the Hyatt Hotel, and he did. They handed him a sheet of paper, just one sheet of paper on which were typewritten 14 points. And those 14 points, I think, illuminate for us very starkly, very sharply, the core substance of what the argument, what the difference is about. When you think of the stakes involved in this confrontation, it's pretty remarkable and surprising that the actual content of the 14 points, the 14 grievances or demands, rarely is heard in public. Most people have no idea what the 14 are. We don't hear a lot of debate or dispute about it in public. They've pretty much sunk in public consciousness and rarely emerge at the forefront of political debate until yesterday, when Anthony Albanese gave a speech where he criticised the government's rhetoric rather than policy substance on China policy. He criticised Peter Dutton and Mike Pizzullo for their alleged warmongering rhetoric, to which Dutton and James Patterson, James is a Liberal senator who happens to be the chairman these days of the PJCIS, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence Security, they both got stuck into Albanese over this speech. And James Patterson said that Anthony Albanese should clarify urgently which of the 14 demands from the Chinese government he would concede on. So the 14 demands briefly flared into public view, and I think we should take a moment to look at them because they do give us a Rosetta Stone of the Chinese government's claims on Australia, the disputes between the two sovereign states, and it's also a bit of a Rosetta Stone into the Xi Jinping regime psychology, I would suggest. Now, when my colleague Jonathan Kearsley wrote these up, he called them the 14 grievances of the Chinese government. Now, I don't know whether you'd legitimately call them grievances or something else. In presenting the list to Jonathan, one of the Chinese diplomats both, by the way, specified that their names and identities not be publicised, but that the list itself should be publicised. They said to him, by way of framing the discussion, China is angry. If you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy. The next day, a spokesman from the Foreign Ministry in Beijing said Australia must, quote, correct its errors. Another Chinese official since has said that if Australia were to withdraw its 14 underlying policy points to back off, that it would be, quote, conducive to a better atmosphere. At the same time, as you know, tens of billions of dollars of Australian exports were made subject to Chinese trade sanctions. I would suggest in those circumstances, with those pressures being applied, they're not so much grievances as demands. I would describe the letter as a démarche rather than a complaint note. I'm going to run through the 14. I'm giving you the edited down version, stripped of some of the rhetorical flourishes. What's number one? What is the top priority for Beijing? What is this dispute about? It's Australia's foreign investment system. And in particular, the démarche notes three particular sectors where Chinese investors have been frustrated: infrastructure investment, agriculture investment, and animal husbandry were the three mentioned. Demand number two. What's the second greatest grievance demand? It's the Huawei ban, Huawei ZTE ban. That the Chinese government wants that reversed. Third, the foreign interference and espionage laws that the Turnbull government introduced with the support of Labor Party was passed overwhelmingly. They want the foreign interference laws revoked. Number four, politicising of normal exchanges, in the words of the Chinese embassy, including the issuing of visas for scholars, by which they mean the visas for the Chinese scholars which were revoked and they were forced to leave the country. Number five, the Australian request for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. Number six, and this is quoting the letter again, incessant wanton interference in Xinjiang, Hong Kong and Taiwan affairs of China. The seventh demand is that Australia should stop making statements to the United Nations on the South China Sea. The eighth demand, siding with the US, that Australia should stop siding with the US anti-China campaign is the wording, including COVID disinformation. The 9th demand, that Australia revoke the Foreign Relations Act. The Foreign Relations Act is the one which gives the federal government the power to discontinue agreements between states and foreign countries. The 10th on the list is government funding to ASPI should be stopped, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. The 11th is to complain about the raid on Chinese journalists' homes by ASIO. The 12th is Australia should stop blaming China for cyber attacks. The 13th is Australia should stop criticism of the Chinese Communist Party and should stop racist attacks, unquote. The 14th, and finally, is Australia should stop unfriendly media reports on China. Now you'll notice the first thing that's not on the list is trade. There is no trade on that list at all. There is investment. Foreign investment is number 1. Huawei ban on the 5G system, number 2. So investment features, but not trade. So none of the items subject to Chinese tariffs, whether it's thermal coal, lobsters, barley, beef, and so on, they are the instruments of pressure, but they are not the actual source of dispute, according to this list provided by the Chinese embassy in Canberra. I've grouped the 14 into 3 categories. I think they break pretty neatly into 3 categories of different types of demands. The first 4 demands are demands for more power over Australian policy and law and affairs. The second set of 4, so that's the first 4 demands. The second 4 demands are demands that Australia not criticise Beijing. So the first 4 are about actual exercise of influence and control over Australia. The second are demands that Australia stop criticising Beijing. And the final set, the last 6, are all demands for deference to China's interests or sensibilities one way or another, or should I say China's government interests or sensibilities. So I think you can see from those 14 that to meet those demands, Australia would have to hand over control of its foreign investment law, its telecommunications regulations laws, its anti-interference laws, its visa policy to Beijing. Those would have to be ceded to meet those demands. Further, to meet the other demands, the Australian government would have to do things which are not in its power. Muzzle the free press, muzzle the media, censor members of parliament. The government itself should surrender its voice in world affairs, that Australia should abandon treaties on navigation and overflight because that touches on the South China Sea points about which the Chinese embassy was complaining. And Australia would have to, of course, fall silent on China's human rights practices. At the time the list was published, a fellow at Brookings Institution called Rush Doshi wrote that this coercive economic leverage to shape Australia's internal behaviour is a kind of illiberal order building. The list, said Rush Doshi, is a partial guide to norms, the norms of that illiberal order. Interesting interpretation. That fellow, Rush Doshi, is now the China director on Joe Biden's White House National Security Council. The scope and the audacity of these demands on Australia means that as soon as that list was publicised, it guaranteed that the Australian government could not yield on any of them, even if it wanted to. Even if the Morrison government thought there was some scope to negotiate on some of those areas of argument, the moment it's made public, the moment it's in that form, the moment it's known as a demand by the Chinese embassy, it puts the government back up against a wall, and the government has no scope politically, in public opinion or on the floor of the parliament, to make any concessions on those points of policy. Interestingly, it might nonetheless have left Beijing some wriggle room to negotiate or retreat, because the document itself was not an official document. It was presented not to an Australian official, but to a journalist. It wasn't on Chinese embassy letterhead. It was on a plain sheet of paper, no names attached, and the diplomats handing it over to the reporter asked that their names not be used. So it can, at some point, if it were to become convenient, could be disowned as any sort of official document. Now, it seems pretty unlikely. I think we could probably all agree that Xi Jinping will back off any of these demands, especially as Beijing is about to, in the next few weeks, head into the 100th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. It will be a tremendous parade of nationalism and sentiment and political self-aggrandizement. In those circumstances and with that timing, it seems a pretty forlorn hope that Beijing would in any way relent on those demands. Even though just yesterday, Xi Jinping himself gave a speech where he urged party leadership to make China a more lovable, that's the word. He said, we should make China a more credible and lovable power on the world stage. So even though he wants to be lovable, I don't think it's going to involve bringing down the flag on any of those 14 demands. So because of the way that's been done and presented, I think neither Anthony Albanese nor Scott Morrison will be about to suggest compromising on any of the 14. But what it does do, it tells us that that is what this confrontation is about. It is a test of sovereign will between the People's Republic of China and the Commonwealth of Australia. It's a test of sovereign will. As you know, in recent years, the Chinese government started to pick up and became very fond of a term that was invented by some American marketing executive in the 1980s, and that is win-win, the win-win solution. And Xi Jinping for years has talked about wanting to pursue win-win solutions with other countries. I think so long as the 14 demands remain immobile on the table, we can only see lose-lose in the immediate Australia-China future. Thank you very much, and now I look forward to the interesting talent.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Peter Hartcher. Thanks, every one of you, for coming out on such a cold, wet night. We'll try to heat things up a bit in here with a modified Oxford-style debate featuring 6 young scholars who will debate Australia's policy approach towards China. We will begin with a pre-poll of the views of the House, your views, followed by statements from our 6 debaters, followed by questions from you, the House, posed to those debaters. Then we'll take a final poll of the House view. The success of our debaters will be decided not by the overall vote on the resolution, but by the shift in your views between the pre-poll and the final poll. As your modest moderator, I reserve to myself the right to have the final say over adjudicating the results of this debate. So without further delay, let me begin by introducing the question. Resolved. This House believes that Australia's current China policy approach is in the Australian national interest. All in favor, please say yay. Yay! Those opposed say nay. Nay. All right. It seems to me that the yays have it, at least for now. But let me introduce some people who just might change your mind. Please hold your applause until all of the debaters have been introduced. For the affirmative, Yuki Chung is a Bachelor of Commerce and Economics student at the University of New South Wales. Please come on up and take your spot, if you will wait one moment. For Chanam Torres, who is an economics and law student at the University of Sydney and serves as an officer on the New South Wales Young Liberals Executive. Satya Marar is a CIS research associate and admitted solicitor to the Supreme Court of New South Wales. For the negative, Un Jiang is the producer of China NACON at the Australian National University's Australian Centre on China in the World. Idi Yan is a Chinese-born and raised international student studying statistics and urban informatics at the University of New South Wales. Frank Yuan is a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney's Department of History, researching Australia's attitudes and policies towards the People's Republic of China. Thank you, all 6, for debating tonight. Please have a seat. Please have a seat. Debaters, I put it to you, this House believes that Australia's current China policy approach towards China is in the Australian national interest. Each of you will have 6 minutes to convince the House of the truth or falsehood of this motion. This time limit will be strictly enforced with a bell. You all know the rules. No punching, no biting, no spitting, no hair pulling. We begin with the affirmative. Speaking for the affirmative, Yuki Chung, you have 6 minutes.
For a long time, we maintained mutually beneficial trade and diplomatic relationships with Beijing. However, in recent decades, China has resorted to a litany of strategies from espionage, economic retaliation, IP theft, debt diplomacy to outright military expansionism, where it has become clear that the Chinese government, left unchecked and unconstrained, is no longer just a threat to its own citizens, but to the rest of us and to the values we hold dear. So, what has Australia's policy response been? Firstly, tore up Victoria's Belt and Road deal with Beijing, a deal that raises national security concerns and should be a federal government matter, not one for a rogue state government. Secondly, restricted the operations of Huawei for legitimate national security reasons and the potential compromise of data security and for the privacy of Australian citizens. Chinese law obliges Huawei to assist Beijing with its surveillance activities, and cybersecurity officials have identified backdoors in their equipment. Thirdly, enacted foreign interference laws, which applies equally to every country, not just China. All of these restrictions that Beijing applies to every country by default, and they think it's a provocation when Australia does it. Despite China's forceful expansionism, they've been left virtually unscathed and financially sound. It is therefore both crucial and commendable Australia has taken the lead by setting an example for the liberal democratic world, and indeed all nations that are challenged by the rise of China in holding Beijing to account. In history, the powers that have threatened the existing status quo, from Napoleonic French, the German Empire, to Nazi Germany. So, what defeated them? A coalition of balancing nations. The difference is we don't seek to defeat or humble China, currently our major trading partner. We seek to contain its worst impulses and insidious tendencies, which promote mutual benefits for all nations while upholding the liberal world order. A coalition of liberal democracies is well placed to check and hold China accountable, not only for its grave internal atrocities, but to constrain China's negative sphere of influence and to promote leadership change that could yield a leader who could soften China's stance. China is not vindictive of us because of Australia's offensive, so-called McCarthyist rhetoric. Rather, it is a product of the stark divide between the conciliatory relationships under Deng Xiaoping to now Xi Jinping's aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy. Detractors may question as to whether contrasting our liberal values against China are just vacuous gestures or platitudes. China tried to ridicule us for our human rights with a picture of a soldier holding a knife up to an Afghan child's throats. But when our special forces were accused of war crimes, it was Australian journalists who did the investigation. And unlike China, our liberal institutions enable for accountability to hold perpetrators against the law. In China, abusing human rights of civilians is not a war crime. It's a state policy. China likes to claim it doesn't export its authoritarian values, but these values and external policies are harming us all while defining how China treats other countries and people. We know Beijing does not respect or abide by a rules-based order. China's abjuration of its duty to uphold Hong Kong's one country, two system treaty with the will of the Hong Kong people, like myself, being forcefully subserved is just one case of Beijing's brazen aggression, unfazed by outcries and global condemnation. And now, with foreign journalists shut out of China, it has become clearer than ever that China has a lot it wants to hide and has no interest in accountability. It falls to us to call them out and encourage others to do so. China is not unique in harming its own citizens. However, China's panoptical surveillance has now transcended beyond geographical constraints. Now, the consequences of China's sinister values, like the disappearance of coronavirus whistleblowers to the prevention of an independent investigation into the alleged lab leak, has prevented critical knowledge for a virus that has plagued the world with devastation. Australia's call for an independent inquiry is not the politicisation of the scientific inquiry. If China has nothing to hide, then it has nothing to fear. They instead responded to a reasonable question by sanctioning us, suggest otherwise, and there is no smoke without a fire. Our rules-based international order has been unilaterally disrupted by China's hubristic desires for regional omnipotence. Unless we ascribe actual meaning to our liberal democratic values, promote them, and reinforce that there are consequences for abusing them, China will continue to erode our enduring values with impunity. Australia has pulled its weight and taken leadership by standing up for the values we hold to the world stage. In doing so, we set an example for everyone else, and that is something as Australians we should be proud of. Thank you.
And thank you, Yuki. For the negative, Unjiang.
I am actually very glad that the first speaker of the affirmative side talked about values because that's what I'm going to focus on as well. But first, let's get back to some basics. What is national interest? In general, we can think of national interest as a combination of security, prosperity, and values. Now, governments do not always act in the national interest. Rather, often they act in their own political interest. We have seen many historical examples where governments deliberately drum up fear and xenophobia for political gains. But we can all agree that they were not in the national interest. In a democracy like Australia, how to balance security, prosperity, and values is always up for debate. The government do not have the monopoly in defining national interest. Indeed, much ink has been spilled in recent years over the optimal balance between security and prosperity, where trade-offs are required. So I will actually not focus on this today. Today, I want to focus on values. I'm arguing that Australia's China policy is against Australia's national interest because it does not make us more secure or prosperous. Yet, it is leading us down the road of authoritarianism, which is against our liberal democratic values. Now, having lived in both Australia and China, I much prefer to live in Australia. Why? Because we're an open society and we have liberal values. But I fear that some of us, including the government, have lost confidence in our liberal values. We see that China, an authoritarian country, is becoming more powerful, and we're rightly concerned about it. Yet, in the government's panic to deal with the challenge of rising China, it has actually started to imitate China. And so, we see national security agencies given extraordinary powers while the civil liberties of Australians are trampled. Take, for instance, the Foreign Relations Act. The Prime Minister said he wants to ensure that we all speak with one voice. Speaking with one voice is what happens in an authoritarian country like China, where you hear the academics and many business people speaking with one voice, the voice of the CCP. A democracy like Australia should not aim to speak with one voice. Take another example, foreign interference. As a result of the panic around foreign interference, we have normalized many illiberal activities by the government. ASIO now raid individuals' homes just because they're members of a private chat group. Meanwhile, the then Minister for Home Affairs defended the raid, saying, if people are here as journalists and they're reporting fairly on the news, then that's fine. But if they're here providing a slanted view to a particular community, then we have concern with that. That's right. The government wants to decide what's fair and what's slanted in media reporting and raid you if it's deemed slanted. This foreign interference panic has also resulted in an alarming increase of suspicions against all Chinese Australians, especially those working in scientific research and in public policy, such as myself. As a result, risk aversion means political organizations and politicians are actively avoiding hiring Chinese Australians. Meanwhile, the University of Sydney is mitigating risks by requiring all PhD students filling out a form that has more intrusive questions than the ASIO security clearance. Indeed, we're going back to the old days of rats under the bed, where international engagement is viewed with blanket suspicion. There are many other examples I could cite, but I'm sure I'm running out of time. Yes, a rising authoritarian China is a challenge that Australia needs to deal with. But the solution should be to hold even more tightly to our liberal values and embrace openness and accountability in government. Tomorrow is the anniversary of 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. We responded to China's human rights abuses then by opening ourselves to those who were prosecuted. If you open a window, some flies are bound to get in. The solution should be to install fly screens and use fly swatters. But the government has instead chosen to board up the windows so no light or fresh air gets in, and use sledgehammers to get rid of the flies. We must remember that historically, great power competition has been a time for trampling of human rights and civil liberties. Think the Red Scare during the Cold War and internment camps during World War II. And so we must be vigilant against that. While we decry the increasing authoritarianism under Xi Jinping, our own government is displaying clear authoritarian tendencies. So I conclude by asking, what's the point of countering China if we just end up like China?
Thank you, Un. For the affirmative, Shannon Torres.
Thanks. Well, our side's argument is that Australia's foreign policy with respect to China is grounded in a consistent and rational framework. Now, the charge has been laid by the speaker before me that Australia is drumming up the threat. But our policy is not irresponsible saber-rattling or nationalistic warmongering. It is, at its core, a calculated policy stance that is calibrated to ensure that Australia survives as a sovereign entity in a poorer, more disorderly, and more dangerous world. We yearn for peace, but ideology and realism must walk hand in hand. Now, I'm glad the speaker before me holds liberal values dear, but we must also be aware that liberal democratic values, the values that we hold dear, can only endure when we do what we must to survive. And to understand why Australia's hardline policy stance against China is entirely in our self-interests, we must understand what China is seeking to achieve in our region. China seeks to establish a sphere of influence whereby it is the unquestioned regional hegemon. If China is to prosper, it can't have the US free to maneuver in the Asia-Pacific. By way of comparison, the United States is safe in its own backyard in the Western Hemisphere, and that is why they are able to shape world affairs. If China was free to achieve a similar regional hegemony, it will be because it has pushed the US out of the region, and Australia will have lost its main guarantor of survival. China, being the bellicose and expansionist power that we have seen in recent times, would not let Australia, on the very doorstep of its sphere of influence, remain free to frustrate its designs. And China has already been infiltrating Australia, moving to make us subservient, whether it's cyber attacks and government agencies, threatening and detaining our journalists without cause, attempting to poleaxe our export sector, or attempting to infiltrate and influence our democratic and educational institutions through the United Front networks and Confucius Institutes. These are direct attacks on the liberal values that we all hold dear, and they will only grow worse as China grows more powerful. This aggression is a systemic threat to the pluralistic order that underpins our security. Unlike Australia, China has never conceived of its security as resting in a community of equal sovereign nations abiding by shared norms. Indeed, China must flout these norms if it is to dominate the region. The aggressive island building in the South China Sea, the subjugation of Hong Kong, the increasing pressure on Taiwan, these are all steps on the road to regional hegemony. For 100 years, the balance of power system in Europe, born out of the Congress of Vienna, ensured peace. And this balance was upended when Germany unified in the late 19th century. A new aggressive superstate emerged on the world stage and threatened Russia to the east and France to the west. China's aggression has had a similar dynamic, threatening the equilibrium of the region. And like Imperial Germany in 1914, it is deeply anti-democratic, with territorial, political, and military ambitions to match. But the world has seen systemic threats before. Australia's increasingly hardline stance shows that we haven't forgotten the lessons of Munich. We haven't forgotten that after Czechoslovakia came Poland, and we know that after Hong Kong comes Taiwan. Australia is not creating conflict, as the speaker before me was suggesting. We are simply responding to the new geopolitical reality of increased great power competition. Now, prosperity and security are not fundamentally incompatible, but there comes a point where we have to choose, and Australia has chosen security. The speaker before me talked about balancing security and values. Well, let's talk about that. Our deep trade ties with China were in our best interest at the time. Sure, it got us through the GFC, it lifted our budget bottom line, and this contributed to our power, but only to a certain point. China thought that we would kowtow to it because of our deep trade ties. But security trumps prosperity, in the words of Mearsheimer. No amount of economic coercion will convince Australia to give up its freedom. And Chinese investment in Australia was in our interests, but only up to a point. With greater geostrategic competition in our region comes the greater need to protect our vital infrastructure from compromise. And so, the establishment of the Foreign Investment Review Board, the ending of Belt and Road initiatives, these are all completely appropriate. Banning Huawei is also completely appropriate, given that Huawei is controlled by and answerable to the CCP. And Australia's participation in multilateral military exercises, whether forging closer regional links, this is all to safeguard our security. Australia is just doing what rational powers have always done, balancing against an emerging threat. It was a balance of nations that defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, and NATO as well was able to contain the Soviet Union because of a coalition of balancing nations. And so at the end of the day, ensuring security trumps prosperity. An Asia-Pacific dominated by the ruthless CCP would be a dark place for Australia. And let's remember that this is a regime whose state policy is the erasure of an entire ethnic group, the Uyghur Muslims. Australia must stand up to the clearest threat to its freedom since the Second World War. The eyes of the world are upon us. Will we back down or will we stand firm? We, the affirmative side, know that Australia will never trade away its sovereignty. Not now, not ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanam. For the negative side, Irian.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Salvatore has introduced, I come from China, and I have been only in Australia for 4 years right now. So please bear with me for my non-native English speaking skills. Since I'm Chinese, you might assume that I'm going to advocate for a better relation, and I am, but not because it has nothing to do with my nationality, but because maintaining a good relationship with China aligns with Australia's national interest. I'm not an expert in public policy, nor in international relations. I was a science student, so when I was preparing for this debate, I didn't know much about Morrison's policy towards China, so I Googled it. What's Morrison's strategy towards China? And I later realized, to my surprise, Morrison does not have any long-term strategy in dealing with China, only slogan and hope. If there's no strategy towards China, how would it be in the national interest in the first place? In my argument, I'm going to talk about two aspects, Australia's prosperity and security, and discuss why Morrison's policy towards China is not in its national interests. The affirmative side talked about how a good relationship with China might bring security concern to Australia. This does not have much standing. For the past 80 years, Australia has been dependent on the US to have a place in the national order. However, security does not come from dependence on the US, nor from other countries. Security comes from the country's own prosperity. Prosperity gives Australia more power to determine for itself. The previous speaker said that the policies are calculated and are rational. So let's do a calculation then. 1 in 5 Australian jobs are trade-related. There are 13.5 million people in Australia's labour force today. China's share of Australia's trade is around 30%. So that'll be around 800,000 Australia own their livelihood to trade with China. Not only does trade with China support Australians' healthcare, education, and many other industries, let's not forget, it also supports the country's defense. A surging iron ore price owing to demand from China added $20 billion to government's revenue, which is 4 times the increase in spending on defense. This clearly shows that Australia's security depends on its trading relation with China. On values, I didn't know what Australian values back then, so I Googled again. And I found them on the Australian Department of Home Affairs website. These are respect, freedom, rule of law, democracy, equality, and English as national language. Well, I don't know how many of you really believe those values, but I can tell from UK Chain's speech, she has very strong beliefs in Australian national values. So some of you might know or might not know for China's national values, they are posted everywhere. You can see them in the classroom, on the streets, or in the supermarkets. There are 12 of them to suit a larger population, of course. So let me read it to you. They are prosperity, democracy, civility, harmony, freedom, equality, justice, rule of law, patriotism, dedication, integrity, and friendship. So the only one missing is having English as a national language. But it's okay, we have Google Translate, you know. I don't know how many, so in my point of views, really again, I don't know how many of you believe those values both in Australia and China. They're indeed nice words. They're part of propaganda in my own opinion. So I agree with you that Australia is more like China in that way. I won't say Australia share the same value with China because we do have a lot of differences. But what's the matter? You're all smart people sitting there. I won't fool you with values, those pretty words, because we all know diplomacy does not depend on countries sharing the same values by itself. It doesn't work like that. Australia has a good relationship with Vietnam, a one-party communist country. Is it always about values? No. Australia believes in rule-based international order to support a system where might does not make it right. The US wanted to blow up the WTO dispute resolution body, acting outside the rules and initiating the trade wars not only towards China, but also its own allies. Countries do not have permanent friends, neither permanent enemies, only permanent interests. I heard of this in middle school, and I believe Morrison understands this better than I do. It's also one of Henry Kissinger's favorite quotes. Henry Kissinger, a former US diplomat, visited China while the US and China relations were at the lowest point. He went to China to open relations. I believe same thing can happen between Australia and China. Currently, Australia's China policy is obviously ruining the trade relation between the two countries, and it has brought detrimental influence to Australia's economy. Again, national security does not come from any allies' promise. It comes from the military hardware, which costs a lot of money. If politicians really care about the ordinary Australians' lives, they should put more emphasis on boosting the economy, building more and better infrastructure for all Australians, rather than fighting ideological wars and taking sides in any countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Idi. For the affirmative, Satya Morar.
So Australia should be independent. It should chart its own course. We shouldn't just do something because it's in the interests of the United States. And that's why I'm actually incredibly proud of our current policy towards China, for a few reasons. We were one of the first developed countries to ban Huawei over national security concerns from building sensitive network infrastructure. Let me tell you something about Huawei. Not only do they raise cybersecurity concerns, not only does Chinese law oblige them to engage in intelligence harvesting, and it was their equipment that was used to bug the African Union headquarters, by the way, to gather intel and conduct espionage there. But also, Huawei is a national champion company built up through a system of Chinese government subsidies, loans, and so on that have literally allowed it to underbid its competitors by 70% in securing critical infrastructure contracts in other countries to build up sensitive infrastructure and gain leverage over these countries. And this is very well consistent with the speeches given by Xi Jinping and others in the CCP, where for them, their economic industrial policy about promoting Chinese prosperity, which I think we can all get on board with that, everyone should be prosperous, of course, is indistinguishable from their geopolitical aspirations of achieving hegemony, of becoming a huge, powerful world power and having leverage and having influence over other countries. Now, why does this matter? Well, I think it's pretty obvious to us what they can do with that leverage as soon as they gain it, because they've been so willing to use it and shove it in our face the moment they think they have an opportunity to do so. When we asked a very simple question, can we have an independent investigation into COVID-19? Some of the stuff looks a bit questionable. Can we have an independent investigation? The response was to start tariffing our barley and our wine, not our iron ore, because they actually really need that. Otherwise, they're in trouble. So it's clear that China believes in one set of rules for itself, another set of rules for everybody else. And the problem with that is that this, in a way, is them imposing their inconsistent values on all of us, because those values are going to define the terms of our relationship with them as they become a more and more powerful world power, which is why it falls on us now to set the terms of the relationship and to make 3 points incredibly clear. Firstly, the leverage that you have over us as a trading partner of ours, and I'll go into why actually we have the leverage in a second, cannot be used as a geopolitical bullying tool to get us to abandon our values or to shut up. We're going to raise grievances with you frankly and fairly, because that is what we do in this country, in the same way that you have had no problem doing to us. We respect and welcome it, in fact. Secondly, we are going to continue calling you out on a human rights abuse of your own citizens, because unlike other value systems, liberal democratic values see themselves as being universal. This is the reason why we're eventually able to beat the 2 horrific ideologies of the last century, being communism and fascism, by sending out the message that these values mean something for everyone, regardless of where you come from. And they've made a huge difference to the lives of billions of people all around the world. And hey, if you go a step further and you try to impose your values and your system on everybody else by invading Taiwan, by impinging on the South China Sea, by impinging on the sovereignty of other countries, you might think you can beat us in a war, and right now you probably would, but there's going to be a price to pay. And unless you know that there is a price to pay and it's not worth paying that price, you're going to keep acting the way you're acting, because that's the message that you're sending to us. And finally, just because US hegemony might someday eventually end, God forbid, it's not going to create a power vacuum that you can simply slide your way into and then dictate the terms of the world order from that point forward. There's going to be a price to pay, and that vacuum is going to be filled up by a multipolar alliance of countries that share a common interest in ensuring that you are contained. And this is exactly what's happened. In the years since Australia acted on Huawei, other countries have followed our lead. More recently, European nations have started cooling on China after seeing how Australia has been treated and how Australian diplomats have been ejected from there, Australian journalists have been ejected from there, and have gone cool on the trade agreement that was this close to being ratified. Concerns over Huawei have been raised, and concerns over COVID-19 and the fact that the Chinese government is trying so hard to cover up any independent investigation of the plausible lab leak origin theory are all coming to the fore. So the interesting thing here is that it's not like, it's so bizarre, this idea that we are following the USA's lead, because we did all of this on our own volition. We did not wait for the USA to act. We went and did it ourselves. And in doing so, we set a far more important example than the USA, because if Australia can go out and ask these very reasonable questions and do it because it's the right thing to do, then other countries can follow suit. In fact, as soon as we came out questioning China on COVID-19, over 140 nations signed a joint agreement that even China, in the end, ended up capitulating to, a resolution calling for that independent investigation. So it's clear that what we do matters and what we do works, and other countries look to us. And this is the only way that we can ensure that going into the future, we can still have a mutually beneficial relationship with China built on respect, But we're not going to gain their respect if we capitulate to them. These humiliating 14 demands, are you crazy? You think they would agree to any one of those demands themselves? Their issues with us are things that they would never, ever permit by default any other country or any other foreign company from another country to do. You try to get Telstra to go and build out a 5G network in Shandong province. Good luck to you. They'll kick you out. So I want to end by quickly saying, I'd like to paraphrase a former Australian Prime Minister. We will not be lectured to on human rights and values by that government. We will not. Not now, not ever. And if Xi Jinping wants to know why the rest of the world is turning cold on him all of a sudden, he doesn't need to point his fingers at Australia. He needs a mirror. And when he sees Winnie the Pooh staring back at him, he'll know that Australia was leading first. Thanks.
Thank you, Satya. And finally, Frank Yuan for the negative.
Thank you. The talks from the opposing side of the smoke without fire, lessons from Munich, and violations of rules-based order, it all reminds me of the debate about WMD and Iraq. And it reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld, but I also prepared this part in advance, actually. But Rumsfeld said, in policymaking, there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. Now, we've heard plenty in these three categories tonight, but of course there's a fourth category in this matrix, which Rumsfeld missed. They are the unknown knowns. In other words, these are things we know without realizing. These are our unexamined preconceptions that inform judgments. For Australia's China policy, the crucial unknown known is a refusal to live with a great power of Asia. It drives a policy that undermines all major aspects of Australian national interest and has hindered Australia in the past. Since encountering large numbers of Chinese diggers in the 1850s gold rushes, European settlers developed a profound sense of vulnerability to Asia. As nationalism took hold, identification with Britain and rejection of Asia reinforced each other. Securing the White Australia policy, as it came to be known, was an important rationale for the federation of the colonies, and Australia was defined against Asia, white, spacious, affluent, and enlightened. Existential threat of Asia came close to being a self-fulfilling prophecy. In 1919, to safeguard the White Australia policy, Canberra successfully lobbied against Japanese proposal for a racial equality clause in the Treaty of Versailles. This severely alienated Japanese opinion, contributing to Japan's turn towards expansionist militarism in the 1930s, and thus the Pacific War. But America's emergence from World War II as an English-speaking superpower gave Australia a new strategic blanket. Yet then came a new Asian geopolitical force, the People's Republic of China in 1949. How unfortunate. Frustrated by America's continued support for its Civil War rival and by American conduct of the Korean War, Beijing's intervention in Korea signified its rejection of a Pax Americana that reached its doorsteps. But Australia under Robert Menzies took a cautious approach. Canberra cancelled restraint on Washington in the Korean War and the 1954 Taiwan Strait crisis. Menzies had his own blind spots, of course, as exemplified in the Suez crisis. Seeking to defy material conditions and preserve British global power, he achieved the opposite. With the Vietnam War, the Menzies government sought to embed American military presence in Southeast Asia to contain a supposedly expansionist China. So Australia was not dragged into the Vietnam War. Yet, nevertheless, it did misjudge American power, the nature of the conflict, and China-Vietnam relations. Still, Australia was spared the geopolitical fallout. Threatened by Moscow, Beijing tacitly accepted American primacy in the early 70s. Also, Gough Whitlam's visit to China in 71, fortuitously beating even Henry Kissinger by a few days, gave Australia a clean slate with Beijing. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, China remained internally focused and too weak to challenge America until the 2010s. Now, as Max Such has written in the Financial Review, in response to a more strident Beijing, the Morrison government no longer prioritizes trade and dialogue in the relationship and is, I quote, straining to encourage the US to remain the dominant military power in East Asia, unquote. it consistently takes pride in being out in front, in alerting others to perceived Chinese threat. The Cold War framework of containment returns, and manifesting in apparent rhetorical excesses we have seen recently. Now, the ideal scenario for Canberra seems to be China backing down once again. But today's China is much more powerful and much less tolerant of American primacy in Asia. The cost of containment and risks and consequences of escalation, including a nuclear war, are much higher than in the 50s and 60s. So surely this calls for even greater degree of caution and pragmatism. And Australia may be once again underestimating China's peacetime constraints from neighbours and domestic issues, some of which are underpinned by global challenges we share, such as climate change and economic imbalances. Therefore, the current policy sacrifices trade and diplomatic interests without making Australia more secure. Ultimately, Australia has to live with a great power it doesn't like, as many other nations have done. They do so by patient engagement and deterrence, not provocation or capitulation. To sum up, the negative side argues that 1, Australia's current China policy does not make Australia more secure or prosperous, while leading it down the road of authoritarianism antithetical to its liberal democratic values. 2, Australia's prosperity, which underpins security, partly depends on trade with China. The bilateral differences shouldn't be exaggerated to harm the broader relationship. 3, attempting to encourage the US and allies to contain China is too dangerous in today's world, while a cautious balancing of engagement and deterrence is possible. So I would like to conclude by quoting another American. This one I approve of. President John F. Kennedy, let's never negotiate out of fear, but let's never fear to negotiate. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move to question time. Members of the House, I'd like to invite you to line up at the respective microphones. To direct a question to the affirmative team, please line up here at the right. To direct a question to the negative team, please line up here at the left. Please come on forward. We'll take questions one and one, starting with the affirmative side. Please go ahead and line up so we can get as many questions in as possible. I note one question per lineup. If you would like to ask a second, a third, a fourth question, please just return to the back of the queue and we will get to you. I have not had the opportunity yet to use my bell because our debaters have been so disciplined. Please give me the opportunity. I won't hesitate to use it. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Salvatore. My name's Andrew. I'm married to a Chinese woman who came here just after Tiananmen Square, and therefore she enjoyed Bob Hawke's liberalism to stay. My mother-in-law spent 8 years in a Chinese jail for corruption allegations. Eventually she got to Australia. One of my business partners is now in jail in China. Now, that's the preface to the situation in that the scene. The question then is, there's a saying that says, kill the chicken to scare the monkey. Is Australia the chicken?
Please, to the affirmative.
Yeah. Australia absolutely isn't the chicken. We have, we're one of the world's top 20 or so economies. And what's more important is the fact that China actually needs us just as much, if not more, than we need China. And for the next 10 years, they need us more, actually, because they're not getting their iron ore of the same quality and of the same efficiency from any other country. Now, they've desperately tried to find other suppliers, and they're struggling. They were doing that even before our so-called rhetoric became an issue to begin with. They've tried to develop mines in East Africa. They've said they'll build the infrastructure and the roads and so on. That will take years and years and years to achieve. And they're not getting it from Brazil or India either, because the transportation costs from Brazil are higher, they're unreliable, their mines are shutting down. They need us. And if that's going to happen, we have to set an example and say, look, we're happy to keep selling you this iron that you need. We're happy to support you. We need to have an agreement, an arrangement of mutual respect between the two of us. And the funny thing is, it's not just Australia. Lithuania recently pulled out of free investment compact, a trade arrangement with China over its human rights record. So, when we fight back and show that we are not chickens, the rest of the world is able to see that. And it's very important that we set the example.
Thank you, Sacha. Question for the negative team.
Hi, my name is Adrian. You mentioned, I have a question for Yidi, because you mentioned Vietnam, and I want to say that there are many examples of China intercepting Vietnamese boats in the South China Sea, and there is the US and other countries has come to support Vietnam in responding towards these actions. So my question is, how should Australia, given its harmonious relations with Vietnam, build an alliance with the country to prevent such actions from the CCP?
You can interpret the question how you see it.
Well, that's better. I actually quite find it interesting that Vietnam is also a communist country ruled by a communist party. Yet, in our last time when the foreign minister met with a counterpart from Vietnam, she said that we have shared values. So we have shared values with the communist country, Communist Party of Vietnam. I found that quite interesting. But back to the question of South China Sea. Well, of course, Australia should always uphold a rules-based order. We're a signatory of UNCLOS, United Nations Conventions on the Law of Sea, unlike United States, which never ratified it. So we should always hold the rules of law, international law. But the problem is now we're in the time of great power competition. And during the time of great power competition, great powers like to ignore rules, international rules. So although we talk about liberal international order, United States is just as adept at basically ignoring international orders, including with the invasion of Iraq, etc. But as a middle power, what we should do is we should always band with other middle powers and build up a coalition to encourage all great powers, both great powers, to basically obey the rules. From a middle power's perspective, unfortunately, we are not a great power. From middle power's perspective, rules benefits us. From great power's perspective, rules constrain them. So what we should be doing is definitely encourage great powers, enmesh them into the international rules.
Thank you. Question for the affirmative team.
I think everyone here knows that New Zealand hasn't gotten as stale with China as we have. And Jacinda Ardern, in many ways, I think is an improvement over ScoMo. And I would say that for their much better relationship, they have not become a People's Republic of New Zealand. And what would your take be on us following something similar to New Zealand and then keeping some sort of workable relationship and strategic ambiguity between both China and America? Thank you.
I'll probably take it. Yeah. Look, I think, New Zealand's an interesting case. But we look at New Zealand's, their places in alliances, and I think they're quite firmly, within the liberal international order. For example, they're within Five Eyes, and so I don't think, there's scope there perhaps to argue that, they might have a better relationship with China. I think at the end of the day, we know where they're going to fall. Part of our case was that, Australia is doing what it needs to do to survive, and so 10, 20 years ago, that meant trading with China, quite robust ties, and perhaps New Zealand is sort of just lagging behind in that sense. But all nations that are rational will do what it takes to survive, and I think there will come a point, perhaps when New Zealand will have to make that hard choice, and I think all the indicia are there as to what choice they will make.
Thank you. Question for the negative team.
Yes, my name's John. I have a question for Frank. In the knowns and unknowns that you mentioned, I'm just wondering, in Australia gives refugee protection to thousands of Falun Gong practitioners because they're persecuted in China. It's a two-part question. Is that a known or unknown to yourself, the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners? The second part is about ideology. Australia's current strategy to China is driven by understanding that the Communist Party's ideology is not rhetoric, it's not theoretical, it's practical. And I'm just wondering if you know of the this talk given by John Garner, who's the ex-Sydney Morning Herald correspondent to China. He was the advisor to Malcolm Turnbull back in 2017. He has a very interesting article called Engineers of the Soul, what Australia needs to know about ideology in Xi Jinping's China. I'm just wondering if you're aware of that one.
So if I may be allowed slightly longer to answer both questions. Well, for the first one, it's not, I think, with respect, not entirely within the scope of tonight's discussion about Australian interest, Australian national interest. Now, surely that's part of Australian national interest if that's, if that among Australian citizens. But I see that as just part of a subset of a global Australian national interest, which does include protecting its citizens from foreign interference, from intimidation. So that's the extent I can answer it. I have very little knowledge on the subject. Second, I'm not terribly familiar with Mr. Garnett's work, but I'm aware of this idea about Communist China pursuing its ideology and being very serious about it. And they are, to some extent, absolutely. But then you should also look at what they practice. So just like how rules-based order is quite often violated in practice, and therefore in practice the ideology is as much about might makes right as about we sticking to rules-based order. So in practice, the Chinese government has been very cautious, for the most part, arguably, until very recently. Now, they might have made some mistakes in the prosecution of their interests, but that still doesn't suggest to me to be a turning point of some sort of global conquest. For one, they're still extremely internally focused, and much of what they say in newspapers, media, including quite often what Chinese diplomats are saying, they're as much intended for domestic audience as they are for foreign audience. So I always take ideology seriously, but so seriously that I think we should look at what they actually do in every sphere of policy rather than just take what they say on the surface. And because that's partly what the West, how the West misread China's policy in the 50s and 60s, taking some of the more bombastic statements too literally in the 50s and 60s.
Thanks. We have a question for the affirmative team.
Hello, my name is Trevor. I'm a survivor from USyd. I study veterinary science and in understanding a bit more about the agriculture sector in a domestic market and international market of Australia. And so my question is around, there's a lot of instability around the agriculture sector regarding environmental instability. And recently, I feel like it's become improved a lot more recently. So why should we create more instability towards the family-owned farmers where they survive through droughts and stuff, and now they have to think that the 70% of their income, which goes to export, now might not be there anymore. So that's my question.
Thank you for your question. Well, with respect to our reliance, especially the agriculture industry, on Chinese as a form of income, I would like to make a point and say that we can see from our wine, barley, and all of our other exports, especially our primary and secondary industries, we've especially diversified it to the British and to our allies. And I think that solely saying that, that we should be just relying solely on China or that the market has to fix these things, I don't think that's completely correct to say, quite frankly. And I think that Australians, we are able to diversify and to expand our trade, especially many countries are also in our same position. It is not just Australia who is who is also facing a internationalist relationship with China, it is also, you know, all of our many allies which have similar liberal values.
For the positive team.
Yeah. One-party states are terribly dangerous. Hitler, Mao, Stalin, they did mass genocides. They killed a large number of people. And they also went to war with their neighbours. And we see Putin doing the same thing. And we see the head of China, who's now made himself the head of China for life, and who's also doing grave human rights abuses in places like Hong Kong and the Muslim population in the west of China. So my question is can Australia really trust the US to protect us? There's 1 billion people in China. We're a population of 20 million. America's gone through a period of being very isolationist. What can we do to actually guarantee that if there was a war, that we'd be in a position to ensure that this country was safe, particularly from invasion? And what do you think about Australia getting nuclear weapons?
Sure. Thanks. So, you know, there are no permanent friends, there are permanent interests, and as things currently stand, it is in America's interest for them to support Australia and to back us because they stand to lose a lot in terms of their economic leverage, their trade leverage, their technology leverage to China, which now challenge them on all these fronts. There's also concerns that you know, China's ability to use the leverage of their domestic market against US multinational companies is being used as a form of undue influence to push political objectives. This is something that the conservative side of the US often brings up. I disagree that the US has entered a period of isolationism. If anything, with the election of Joe Biden, it's going back the opposite way. We're seeing now, what's actually fascinating is Trump came in with a range of unprecedented moves, like forcing European allies to pay more money for their own defense, and a range of retaliatory, well, not always retaliatory, but a range of tariffs on other countries. And the Biden administration has interestingly kept a lot of these things that he initially claimed to oppose, but is then playing, you know, he must have some smart people behind the scenes advising him because he seems to be fostering a multilateral alliance with other countries more effectively. So we actually get the best of two worlds, where on one hand, the world is coming to rely on America a bit less and realizing that we all need to pull our parts together and pull together to deal with future threats, including China. But on the other hand, there's now a bigger focus on building those alliances so we can all work together in this regard. So I'm actually quite optimistic that America and, you know, what's the name, Blinken, the security general, I believe is his position. He came out saying that we will have Australia's back going forward. So I think we're in a very good position. Regarding whether we can, whether we can always be secure in a world with a one-party state, to its credit, China does have some mechanisms. They're not democratic, but a bad leader faces enough of backlash that he can be removed and replaced. And I believe that if we send the message of this, the wolf warrior approach and methodology of Xi Jinping is an absolute failure, this sort of aggression is not going to fly, it's not going to be in China's interest, then in 2 years when he's up for re-selection, there's going to be a coup. And the people who are sick of being under his thumb, you know, he's more of a micromanager than Deng Xiaoping was, are going to have something to say about it. So I think we're in a good position.
Thank you. Question for the negative team.
Hello, my name's Damien Pace. I'd just like to thank you all for speaking today very well. I'd just like to reword slightly the question of the previous question on this column on the question of containment. Your argument was that perhaps Australia should follow the course of a country like Finland, a more sort of a middle path between, say, China and America, that the containment is a provocation. Neutral power status only provides security if other countries are willing to provide a counter to an aggressive country. Neutrality in itself doesn't give you any security. So why isn't it in our interest as a Western power, not far from China, China is growing into the Pacific, to stand up and be a vocal opponent of China? Why is that not in our security interests?
Thank you. Sorry, unless you want to drop. Sorry. For one, I think, again, the choice is not between neutrality or engagement. Engagement as in being engaged in some sort of security architecture. if you look at the history of, say, Vietnam, Finland, Korea, gosh, they've been allied with, say Korea, they've been allied with sometimes China, sometimes Japan, sometimes they stay neutral, but there's the possibility of being allied with either power. Now, that's not neutrality, I would say, but rather that's a very agile policy posture. So you can, so charting a middle course might not be the best imagery. I would prefer to think of it as keeping options open and watching the situation very closely. Secondly, sorry, I forgot the question. What's the second part of it?
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Now, very quick question for the affirmative.
Thank you. A few decades ago, everybody was worried about how all our oil came from the Middle East. Now all our steel comes from China. 57% of the world's steel supply, in fact, and they get all that iron ore from the Pilbara. So I'm wondering whether there may be a repeat of the 1938 Dalfram affair, Satcher, whereby the wharfies at Whyalla said we're no longer going to load pig iron onto ships destined for Japan because it just invaded our ally, China.
Yeah, I don't think that our iron ore is really being used to manufacture necessarily bullets that are going to kill us. I think if they're going to kill us, they're going to use barrel bombs or some other newer technology. So I don't really necessarily think that applies. I don't think we've come anywhere near that far yet. I see our iron ore exports as our leverage over them. They need that more from us than we do from them. I mean, to be honest with you, we would have an easier time finding other countries as the years go on, as their neighbors become more prosperous, to sell our iron ore to than they would find somebody else to buy it from. So I don't think it's the same.
Let's be very brief. Thank you very much. A quick question for the negative. Very brief.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Tim James is my name. Australia is a Christian nation born out of Judeo-Christian values. In China today, Christians are essentially being persecuted. Churches are being raided, Bible apps are being taken down, people are being disappeared. So does that not, and indeed it's worth pointing out there are thousands upon thousands of Australians living in China who would wish to practice their Christian faith and should be free to do so, but increasingly are not. So does that not point to you to the need for Australia to take the strong stance that it is in relation to its relationship with China and Australia's national security and the right to practice one's faith?
Very brief answer, please.
Well, yes, there are many human rights violations in China. I definitely do not deny that. But when Australia decides to cooperate or to have a common partnership with a country, we have, for example, a lot of common partnership with countries like Saudi Arabia even, and a lot of countries in the Middle East where Christianity is persecuted. So we do not only decide on whether, when we decide on partnering up with a country to cooperate with a country, that's not the only thing we think about.
Thank you. A very quick question for the positive.
Okay, try my best. So you have two, I think we started off today talking about how in the Labour Party there was a rebuttal to the Liberal Party about their China policy, and coming from a background in Taiwanese, being embedded in Taiwanese politics, we have two parties that are essentially defined by their foreign policy, which I think is quite a unique situation on a global scale. How do we avoid the China debate becoming Liberal Party supports a more affirmative stance on China, and Labour Party is a more integrationist or whatever you want to call it approach? So how do we avoid that and I suppose, to borrow the cheesy quote, speak with one voice? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, what's interesting is I read what Albanese said, and he actually doesn't take issue with anything Australia's actually doing. In fact, Labor has, in the last few years, come to give pretty strong bipartisan support for the government's China efforts. The issue seems to be the so-called rhetoric. And what's interesting is Peter Dutton only said that war over Taiwan is a real possibility because he was asked a pointed question about is it a possibility? And he said it's something we need to prepare for, hopefully it never happens. So I actually think that the Labour Party broadly agrees with everything the government is doing. They just need to find a way to sort of attack the opposition because they're having a lot of trouble right now shoring up support prior to the election that's coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And our final question for the negative team.
The second speaker said she could find no long-term Australian strategy through Google, and that diplomacy does not depend on shared values. The Affirmative did not rebut any of that or offer any solution. My question to the negative team is, if you find Australia's policy towards China deficient, what would you provide as a substitute or an improvement in order to deal not with hot wars that people keep talking about, drums of war, but the reality of the grey wars that are going on right now? What would you do about that?
We should definitely strengthen our democratic resilience, democratic institutions. For example, one thing is more transparency for political donations, less power for political donors in politics. Those are all the things we should do better with or without having the threat or challenges of China. Strengthening democratic institutions is something we should be doing regardless.
Right, thank you. And thank you, members of the House, for your probing questions. Those of you who did not have the opportunity to pose your questions, please accept my apology. There will be an opportunity after the talk, of course, to talk to your favorite debaters. But now is the moment of truth. Tonight we have debated the question, and I will read it correctly this time. This House believes that Australia's current policy approach towards China is in the Australian national interest. Members of the House, this is for you to judge. All in favor, please say yay. Yay. All opposed? No. The yays have it, but I find no change over the course of this debate in the opinions, or may I say the change has been balanced in each direction, resulting in no net change. Therefore, I must declare this debate a tie. Congratulations to all of our debaters. Members of the House, thank you. Thank you, Yuki Cheng, Unjiang, Chenem Torres, Idi Yan, Sacha Morar, Frank Yuan. Thank you. Tom, I return the proceedings to you.
Salvatore, thank you very much, mate. That was terrific, and thank you all for being here. Now, CIS unashamedly promotes the principles of classical liberalism, and one of our intellectual heroes is John Stuart Mill, the great British 19th century liberal intellectual. And Stuart Mill once remarked that those who know only their own side of the argument knows very little of that. In other words, only when you recognise the strengths of your opponent's arguments do you recognise any weaknesses in your own. And I think that given tonight's debate, somewhere John Stuart Mill would be proud. So thank you to all speakers. You've been outstanding. I also want to thank Peter Hartcher, who's author of The Red Zone, China's Challenge and Australia's Future. Copies are available to be bought and signed. We at CIS have been very much engaged in the China policy debate. And as I said in my introduction, we've all too often heard from the experts. But tonight, we did something different, and I hope you got something out of it. Thank you so much. We hope to see you again.